Well, there are a couple of reasons that we've been doing this sermon series on the Bible's greatest hits. First one is obvious. These are the most popular Bible verses for a reason. They're great verses. They have a lot of meaning to them. And it's important that we look at them once in a while. But another reason for doing it is that sometimes these are the Bible verses that we kind of take for granted. We read them without actually thinking about what they say. Sometimes we've heard them so many times or read them so many times that we really don't even think about whether we believe them anymore. We say we do, but really, at bottom, do we believe them? Or do we just say believe them because, well, it sounds good to say that? Our Bible verse for today is number 4 on the list of verses at BibleGateway.com. It's Romans chapter 8, verse 28. The Apostle Paul writes, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." In all things, God works for the good of those who love him. Do we believe that? Some of us, at least, would like to say that we do. It sounds good. We'd certainly like to believe it. But then we think about things. Just this week, there was Hurricane Matthew. Killed hundreds of people in Haiti, did a lot of damage in this country. Is that one of the things that God is working in for the good of those who love him? Just a couple of weeks ago, there was terrible flooding in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, not that far away. Is that one of the things that God is working in for the good of those who love him? We hear about all kinds of things like that all the time. Fires and storms and earthquakes and any number of things like that. Do we really believe that God is working in those things for the good of those who love him? Can we have that much faith? Can we trust God that much? And we can bring it closer to home too. I know that some of you in this parish have lost children. Some of you have lost spouses. Others have lost brothers or sisters or other people close to you. Do we really believe that God is working in those things for the good of those who love him? I mean, we'd like to. We'd like to believe that. It would provide an explanation for something that we would really like an explanation for, right? We would like to think that when something terrible happens, there is some way in which God is going to bring some good out of that. But do we really believe it? Can we have that much faith? Can we trust God that much? Now we need to pause here for a minute and note that there's a difference between saying that God caused something and saying that God is going to bring some good out of it. I'm not saying that God specifically decided to make a hurricane hit Haiti. I'm not saying God specifically caused anyone to lose a loved one either. But as we've said before, if we believe in an all-powerful God, we have to believe that God could have prevented all of those things if God had chosen to do that. In fact, God could prevent all bad things from happening if God chose to. And sometimes God does not choose to do that. And sometimes we explain this by saying that God allows us to have free will, and certainly that does play into it. But at the same time, Hurricane Matthew was not the result of some human being's will. So how do we explain that? Well, again, sometimes we say God allowed it to happen because God is going to bring good out of it. And that's a very comforting thought. It makes us feel better. It makes us feel like, well, there is a purpose to this terrible thing that's happened, even if we don't understand what that purpose is. But again, the question is, do we really believe that? Do we really think it's true? Can we have that much faith? Can we put that much trust in God? Or is this just something we say because we're trying so desperately to cling to something that might give some sort of meaning to a situation and give some kind of hope for the future? We know that there are a lot of things about God we don't understand. We know that God is good. We know that God sees the future and we don't. We know that God thinks long term. After all, the Bible tells us in a couple of places that 1,000 years are like one day to God. And so we would really like to think that in the long run, somehow, all of these terrible things we see and hear about, whether we're talking about the world or our country or our friends or our own personal lives, we'd like to think that somehow all these terrible things make sense in the grand sweep of eternity. That somehow God is going to use it all for God's good and God's glory. But again, we keep coming back to the question, is it actually true? Do we really believe it? Can we have that much faith? Can we put that much trust in God? Or are we just saying it to make ourselves feel better? Well, I want to tell you a story. It's a true story. A story that happened in my family. Maybe you can think of a similar story that's happened in your family. My mother was born in Youngstown, Ohio in 1925. She was the fourth of 5 children born to Joseph and Mary Nananichek. They were immigrants from what's now the Czech Republic. Her father, my grandfather, Joseph, was a Presbyterian minister in Youngstown, Ohio. Now, on January 1st of 1929, Joseph Nananichek passed away. My mom was 3 years old. She has no memory of him whatsoever. And that in and of itself has left a hole in my mother's life that she's never really been able to fill, even all these years later. She's 91 now. My grandmother did not want to talk about him a lot. I suppose the pain of it was too hard for her too. But my mother has tried to learn all that she could about her father to try to fill that hole that she still has in some way. And of course, along with all the emotional pain that came from that, think about the family situation that they were in. There was my grandmother, a single mom with 5 kids to raise. And of course, less than a year later, the Depression hit. So there was my grandmother doing everything she could to try to scrape up enough money and enough food to raise 5 children in the middle of the Depression. And she did all kinds of things. She took in washing, she looked after people's children, she did anything she could to try to get enough money for her family. Eventually, she moved to South Dakota, where she had relatives. And the family settled in Yankton. That's where my mom grew up. She went to college in Springfield. She got a teaching certificate. She got a job teaching in Delmont. It's where she met my dad, who was farming about 5.5 miles west of town. And you can probably figure out the rest of the story. My mom and dad eventually met. They got married. That's one of the houses that they lived in before the house on the farm was completed. It still stands in Delmont, I think. It's called the Onion House. They lived in the top floor of that till their house on the farm was finished. Of course, they had a happy life together. They had 3 sons, one of whom, of course, is me. And they've been married 70 years now. They've had a wonderful love story together. But when my grandfather died on January 1st of 1929, my grandmother must have thought that was the worst thing that could ever have happened to her. Now, don't get me wrong, my grandmother was a woman of great faith. She truly was, but still, she would not have been human if she had not sometimes asked God, why? Why did this happen? Why did you let such a terrible thing happen? Why did you not heal my beloved Joseph? He had so much to offer, not just to me, not just to our family, but to his congregation and beyond. Why did you let it happen this way? Why did you not do something? Now, I don't believe for a second that God is responsible for my grandfather dying, but again, God could have stopped it. But instead, God brought something good out of it. The good that God brought out of it was not apparent right away. But had my grandfather not died, my mother never would have moved to South Dakota, never would have met my father. But it took a long time for that good to come about. It was 17 and a half years after my grandfather died that my mom and dad got married. 17 and a half years is a long time by human standards. How different was your life 17 and a half years ago? That'd be early 1999. For me, I was a lawyer in Wessington Springs. I had no thought I'd ever do anything else. Some of you were not born 17 and a half years ago. How different will your life be 17 and a half years from now? That'll be early in 2033. Some of us won't be around then. If I'm still around, I'll be 75. I'll be retired, most likely. 17 and a half years is a long time to you and me. As we said, God thinks long term. That 17 and a half years between my grandfather dying and my mom and dad getting married was nothing to God. It can be hard to believe that God is going to bring something good out of every situation. And it's especially hard when we don't see that good right away. Sometimes it takes longer than 17 and a half years to see the good. Sometimes it's a lot longer. In fact, sometimes we don't even live to see the good that God is going to bring out of a situation. But that does not mean that the good will not come. So can we trust that? Can we have that much faith? Can we have that much patience? The Apostle Paul wrote, hope that is seen is not hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. It takes patience. It takes hope. It takes faith. And it takes trust. In all things, God works for the good of those who love him. The Bible says that. The Apostle Paul wrote it. Can you and I believe it? Can we have that much faith? Amen.